All right, today I thought we would take a look a little bit at Hebrew history. I'm sure that in some class, I don't know, what classes do they have you take here? They have an Old Testament class, right?
Old Testament survey.
But it's a survey of the literature. Like you read some of the prophets, you read some of the wisdom literature, you read some of the Pentateuch. Okay. And so that's really the only class everybody takes, I guess. All right. Well, in there, I'm sure you covered some of this, but this won't be bad. For our purposes, we might be a little more specific about some things than they were. So look at this. We got a wonderful picture here, a painting. Look at, they're looking up at the sky. The other one's looking down. What's going on? It doesn't matter. All right, so we're going to jump ahead. We're not going to start with Genesis chapter 1. Spent a lot of time on, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, so forth. The first 11 chapters we will not cover. We're going to jump ahead a bit to a guy named Abraham. Okay, and Abraham is of the patriarchal period because he is a patriarch. We call him Father Abraham. Do you know that little tune? Father Abraham had many sons, had Father Lane has never heard this before. He's acting like he's never heard it. And I have one of them, and so are you. So let's just... He knows it. No? You don't know it. Okay. Well, now you do. So let's just praise the Lord. That's pretty much the whole song. And it has motions and things. Well, Father Abraham does have many sons, and we are one of them, and so are you. He's one of them. So the idea here, though, is that Abraham goes to Egypt. This is our first contact in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, with Egypt, is when Abraham shows up there. The question is, when did Abraham live, and when did he go to Egypt? The chronology, we have pretty good chronology of ancient Egypt, right? We've got all the different dynasties, and we know the names of pharaohs, and we know a lot of things that they did. If we could plug in biblical history with Egyptian history, you see, that's going to be really a great thing for us, right, to be able to do, if we could do that. The problem is, of course, that it's a little bit tougher than what you might think. Part of that is because, in fact, these Abraham and Moses and these people, Joseph, they are not mentioned in any text that we have yet from ancient Egypt. They're not mentioned. Now, to be honest, I wouldn't expect them to be mentioned. They are important to us. They are important to the flow of the Hebrew Bible, but they were not that important to the flow of Egyptian history. And I suspect, this is what I suspect, and I think I'm right. I was wrong once because I thought that I was wrong, and it turned out I was right, and that was my mistake. Thinking I was doubting myself. No, just kidding. I'm kidding. But anyway. See, so that would be a mistake. I thought, I said something, and then I doubted what I said, and it turned out I was right. Then that was my mistake, was doubting myself. Anyway, you can think about it. Later on, you'll go, oh, yeah. Anyway, or maybe not. Well, let's take a look then at the patriarchal period. Just about the earliest anybody I've seen puts Abraham is around 2150, 2160. So I put that date up there. Okay? The latest I've seen anybody put Abraham is around 1950. 2000 to 1950. So we've got about 150, 200 years where some people debate, when did Abraham live? Did he live in 2150? Did he live in 1950? Did he live somewhere in between? So that's when the patriarchal period would begin. So I'm going to put it here at the earliest dates. But there's some flexibility. How late does it go? Most people then put the end of the patriarchal period around 1800. Again, I'm giving you round dates, just so we can kind of move through this and get an outline. Because I find that sometimes we talk about a lot of these things, but nobody wants to commit to any dates, and therefore they kind of float out there, you know. A lot of kids go to like Sunday school, they learn about David and Goliath, they learn about Abraham, getting ready to kill his son. They learn different stories of the Bible. Where does that stuff fit? So I'm trying to give you some things to hang on here. All right, then of course you know the patriarchs, right? Who are the patriarchs? Well, you got Abraham, you got Isaac, you got Jacob, you got Joseph. Joseph was already mentioned today. That's what made me think maybe we should do this little discussion today. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we get, of course, Abraham visits Egypt with his wife, Sarah, or Sarai, right? And he describes her as, one of the things there, he describes her as his sister, right? And so I've heard people say, oh, he was lying, because it's a Pharaoh. Pharaoh's interested in his, he's going to say it's his sister to stay out of trouble. In fact, it was a custom to call your wife your sister. That was not a completely unknown thing from the ancient Near East. It is pretty interesting to study the background of the ancient Near East and then lay it over what we know about the Bible. Many of the things that seem like strange occurrences and or customs and practices that I find some people spill a lot of ink trying to explain can be explained by saying this is a reflection of the ancient Near Eastern culture. They looked at things differently than we do. They had different words for things, different customs. I don't think that should be so surprising. We're talking about 4,000 years ago in a whole different part of the world. So there were some things that are the same, but there are some things that are different than today. All right, well, anyway, we won't get into all those things. Now, Joseph, you remember what happened to Joe, right? Had a lot of brothers. The thing to remember is the brothers were from two different mothers, right? Think about that. Now, let's say your father had two different wives and had children from both. Just think of the jealousy. The jealousy between the women, potentially, and the husband. Got two wives. My guess is they're keeping a record of who gets what and when they get it. In the Middle East, they can have more than one wife. I mean, it's legally they can have more than one wife. It's kind of like Utah. Anyway, they can legally have more than one wife, and but I found that a lot of them don't. I think some people think, well, these Muslim guys can have more than one wife, so all of them have. They can, have like 4 or 5 wives. They're all going to have 4 or 5 wives. No, a lot of them do not. Most of them have just one wife. Sometimes I've asked them, I get to know someone and say, you guys can have more than one wife. Why do you just have one wife? And basically the answer is, it's not worth the trouble, right? I mean, it's a lot of because it's a lot of conflict, and it's very expensive because what you're supposed to do, at least in the Middle East today, is you're supposed to, at least in theory, treat each wife equally. So that you don't, anyway, I don't think that always happens. But that means that for a lot of these guys, they actually have different residences, different houses for the wives. Anyway, it's a whole nother discussion. But imagine somebody like, in the case of Joseph, you got sisters that are wives, right? One of them's the pretty sister, and one of them is not. Do you think the ladies knew which one was which? I think so. Pretty obvious. There was the old switcheroo, right? He comes and works all those years, and then, put a veil. I don't know how he didn't know, but he suddenly he realizes, ooh, somebody did a switcheroo on me. I got the daughter that I didn't want to marry, and I've married her. Now I got to work to get the next daughter. What do you think about the first wife, knowing she wasn't the first choice, and she was so much so not the first choice that he's going to work a whole nother 7 years just to get the next one that he really wanted? Think there's going to be a little jealousy? Think there's going to be a little tension? And then they have children. The children have that tension. All right. I just say that as just something to think about, right? So that explains why when you go and look and see who's the mother of which one was preferred, so to speak, by the father, and then he has a preferred son, and Joseph is the preferred son. So he was obviously a guy who was not bashful in showing who he preferred in wives and children, right? So the other brothers get jealous. So some of them said, we're going to get rid of this punk. What are we going to do? Kill the sheep. Because, he's going around in like a fancy coat. None of us have that coat, the coat of many colors, right? No, he's the special one, right? He's the younger one, and he's, well, so put some blood on that, take it back to dear old dad, and he disappears. So they don't actually kill him, but they say he was killed, and they sell him off as a slave to the Midianites, I think it was. And the Midianites take him to Egypt and sell him there as a slave. So he's enslaved in Egypt. Joseph, however, as you know, rises to prominence in Egypt because of interpreting of dreams, we're told in the Hebrew Bible. And he becomes the second in command. If we study the history of Egypt, we know that there was a role of vizier. This is undoubtedly what Joseph was, according to the biblical text. The vizier was the one that the Pharaoh would entrust with his whole household. And really the second, the person who made all the sort of day-to-day decisions.
Probably be more than him.
Yeah, well, that's why I got him. If I'm the Pharaoh, I don't want to have to bother with this stuff. That's why I try to get Connor to do all my classes for me so I can just, sit in my office. But so far I haven't talked him into that yet. He's not doing enough as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, yes, that's probably what happens. All right, so Joseph, and of course as the story goes now, his brothers come back. There's a big famine. So what does this teach us? This teaches us that when people have a famine, a drought in Palestine and elsewhere, they come to Egypt. Why? Because Egypt always has food. It's the breadbasket of the ancient world. That fits what we know about Egypt when we study Egypt. Because of the flooding of the Nile, because of the inundation, as it's called, there was always water to plant and to irrigate and to raise food. So they never, I won't say they never suffered at all, but they could overcome what other people could not because of the Nile. So they come back in, right? And they don't recognize him. He recognizes them. And then once they realize who he is, they think, we're in big trouble. This guy's an important guy. He's going to have us put us into slavery. It'd probably be, wouldn't that be fair? You guys enslaved me, now I'm going to enslave you. But that's not what he does. And not only that, but that is then when they are invited in during the time of Joseph. So if we knew the time of Joseph, then we could figure this out. Now, we could put this into the Middle Kingdom. Most people could at least put it into that. If we could get more than that, but the Middle Kingdom. So a couple things, and I've already stated the one thing, is that, for example, I have heard guys preaching sermons and teaching lessons where they say the Hebrew slaves built the pyramids. That's simply not true. Because as we know, the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom period. The earliest anyone puts the patriarchal period in the time of the Hebrew bondage or slavery is Middle Kingdom. Nobody's building pyramids then. Now it says they're making bricks without straw, stuff like that. They are building things, but they're not building pyramids. So then when is the bondage in Egypt? We're going to call it that. So we got the patriarchal period, the bondage or the slavery. When are the Israelites enslaved in Egypt? This is often called in textbooks the bondage in Egypt of the Israelite people. Again, we don't know exactly when the Pharaoh arose that knew not Joseph, but a lot of these Hebrews come. We know that they settle in the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen is in the Delta region. It's it's way in the north. It's actually kind of the northeast. Good farmland, and that's where they settle. And they prosper. They start having a lot of little Hebrew babies. Right? In fact, so many that some Egyptians begin to see them as a threat. These Hebrews are just multiplying and multiplying. So then we are told in the text, but although not identified, who, it says, a Pharaoh, there arose, I think this is probably the King James, but I like the way it sounds. Then there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. That sounds very good. I like the way that sounds. So this way, I think that's King James. That's pretty close to the King. You can look it up. All right, look it up.
What chapter is this?
Lane will tell you.
22. I don't know.
I didn't see if that's correct.
All right. All right, you guys look it up. But you've got a King James there. Okay.
22 chapters in.
He didn't even tell you what book to look.
No, he didn't.
So if it's not in Genesis 22, it might be in another.
2 or 1 in Exodus.
Are you in Genesis or are you in Exodus?
Well, if it's
It should be in
Pharaoh
Genesis.
who knew not
Joseph.
Exodus 1.
Well, while they debate that, I'll move on. So if you find it, let me know.
It's 1 verse. Hold on, I just had
Exodus 1,
verse 8.
verse 8. All right, you got that, Taylor?
Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph.
Huh. Doesn't say Pharaoh, though, a new king. That knew not Joseph. Well, I guess I made my own translation. All right. But the knew not, that's what I like. The knew not Joseph. All right. So then the question is, now the Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph, who knew him not, takes a different attitude. They are no longer free living in the land of Goshen. They are now enslaved. So when did that happen? I'm putting the date around 1640, but to be honest, I don't know the exact date. Part of that depends as to when you put the Exodus. Because what we're going to find out, the dating of the Exodus is the watershed, is the benchmark of all the chronology of the Old Testament. Certainly of the early period of the Old Testament, till you get to the time of the kings. All this early period of the Old Testament, you would date forward from the Exodus and back from the Exodus, whenever you put it. Now, the date that I have here, 1446, is the ending of the bondage in Egypt. That's another way of putting it's the time of the Exodus. Because how do they get out of slavery in Egypt? They all leave. Right? They're leaving because of the persecution during the time as being slaves. And then we get to the guy named Moses. By the way, the name Moses is an Egyptian name. You got Thutmoses. Moses is the same root. Moses means to be drawn. So the one who is drawn out. And of course that comes from the story of Moses as a baby. So you remember that story, right? They're being persecuted, and in fact the Pharaoh wants to thin out the number of Hebrews because there's just too many of them. And so what does he do? He orders that the male children born are to be killed to sort of thin out the population. Now, this decree has a hard time because women, of course, women are not giving birth in hospitals or something. They're doing it at what we might call at home. But there are midwives. The midwives are encouraged to dispatch the child right away, as the British would say, dispatch. But some of those ladies don't want to do that. They're not following that order very closely. And so then soldiers are decreed to go in and take children. Well, to hide Moses then, Moses is placed in a tiny little boat, right, a basket, and set afloat in the Nile a little bit upstream from where the Pharaoh's daughter and her retinue, her entourage, are down by the Nile doing lady things down by the Nile, okay? Whatever it is they're doing down there. Washing themselves, hanging out, having a biscuit. I don't know what they're doing, but they're there. Biscuits. Again, in the British sense, that's a cookie. I give my dogs biscuits. I call them dog biscuits. To try to make them British, even though they're really Mexican dogs. They're Chihuahuas. They're from Chihuahua, Mexico. At least their ancestors are. My dogs tell me they've never been to Mexico. I don't know if I believe them or not. They don't really like the really hot weather, so I don't know how well, I think even in Mexico they're kind of kept out of the sun. Kept out of the sun, yeah. I don't know how well they would do. I did see a display, you know what I read? I don't tell my dogs this. That in fact, the Chihuahuas were often used for dinner. I don't want them to know that. They had two purposes. One was to kind of be a bed warmer, because they like to go under the blankets and get down around your feet and stuff, keep you warm. The other one is for lunch. Okay, so Moses, you can divide his life into 3 periods, roughly 40 years each. 40 years as a prince. He grows up, therefore, in the household of the Pharaoh. Which Pharaoh? That's what we're trying to get to. So he lived as a part of the household of the most powerful person in the most powerful country of that time. In the ancient world, there was no country more powerful than Egypt, and there was no person in Egypt more powerful than the Pharaoh. That's the household he's growing up in. So think about that. So that movie, Spielberg titled his movie The Prince of Egypt, right? Maybe you've seen that one, the cartoon thing about Moses. I don't know if I've ever seen it, but I've heard of it. The Prince of Egypt, which I think is a good title for it because he was a prince for 40 years. Then, of course, you remember he finally discovers somehow that he is Hebrew, right? And he begins to identify anyway with the Hebrews. Is that cultural appropriation? No, I think he really was Hebrew. And then he gets into an altercation with an Egyptian and kills him. He murders an Egyptian. Let's just put it pretty blunt. He murders the Egyptian because he gets mad. And then he decides to get out of Dodge, as we used to say, get out of town, so that he doesn't get incarcerated and probably executed.
I think what's really pertinent about the murder is that he did it like a serial killer, like a psychopath. He didn't just do it out of anger. He looked both ways to make sure nobody was around. And then he killed the guy and hit him in the sand.
That's the way I always do it. I'm just joking, Mr. YouTube. That was a facetious comment. I never have buried anyone in the sand. Okay. This is being recorded, so I have to be careful. That was all joke. That was all facetiousness. Everyone here in the room agrees, right? Okay. And then the last 40 years of his life as the leader of the Hebrews. So he runs away, basically, into the desert, and here he's eventually taken in by a band of friendly shepherds. He becomes a shepherd. He marries a lady, and he settles down, becomes a shepherd. So he's then 80 years old when he receives the burning bush, the message of the burning bush. By the way, the traditional site for all this is Mount Sinai, or in some of the songs that I've sung, Sinai is the way they have you pronounce it. But it's Mount Sinai, and that is a part of Egypt today. It was sort of in the realm of Egyptian territory at that time, but it's very remote. And it's desert, but then it's very mountainous, which you have to remember, it's very mountainous. I'll probably show you some a presentation about it at a later time, but it's very rugged there because I went there and I climbed all the way up to the top of the traditional Mount Sinai, and it's a long ways up. So 40 years as a leader, and you remember when the burning bush, you can go to the monastery. There's a monastery there, St. Catherine's, and you go inside the monastery, they point to the bush of Moses. Say, this is the bush that was burning when Moses was here. And since I'm tall enough, I could reach the bush. I've touched the bush that burned and was not consumed. Well, or so they say. And then I climbed the mountain. So then he goes back and he delivers them out. So this gets us to the date of the Exodus. And now we've only got 3 minutes left.
Rush through it.
Rush through it?
Yeah. That's what historians do, right? They rush through things and don't think them through.
Whoa, wow.
I'm saying this is
not only did he say they rushed through them, but then he added that last part. They don't think about it. They don't think it through. They just do it. Well, I will introduce the topic. We will probably have to come back to it at next week or whatever, our next meeting. The date of the Exodus. As I have told you, this is the watershed of the chronology, of biblical chronology, of Old Testament chronology, of pre-kings of Israel. You know, we have a pretty good sense of the chronology of the Old Testament. Once you get to, say, Saul, David, Solomon, that we got down pretty well. But up to, say, the Exodus and the conquest and the patriarchs, all of that depends on where you put the Exodus. The time you put Moses dictates then the time where you have Abraham, and the time where you have Joshua, and the time where you have the conquest. By the time we get up to the time of the kings, the kingdom period, then that is pretty well fixed because you have other sources that are Mesopotamian sources, that is, coming from Babylon and so forth, that help us date things sort of from the other way. Israel is in between Mesopotamia and Egypt. So this later, what I'm calling later, history of Israel, the state of Israel and so forth, is all dated through, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and so forth. This early period is the Egyptians. All right, there are 2 dates, now with 1 minute left. He wants me to just talk and don't think. Well, I do that all day. That's what I get paid to do. There's an early... I only get paid to talk. If you think about it, that's what people pay me to do, is to talk. They say it's to teach. And I do try to teach. But you see, teaching involves learning. I can deliver information. I can't necessarily get you to learn it. That's a tough part that's not totally within my control. We're now out of time. All right. So we will continue this next time.